I'd like to introduce Troy LaRaviere, the President-elect of the Chicago Principals Association. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for having me here this morning. I want to remind people that this press conference is taking place within the context of a record number of principals who have submitted or informed their local school councils that they intend to submit their resignations and end their employment with the Chicago Public Schools by the end of this year. Those resignations have been submitted in part for 3 reasons. And all 3 of those reasons are embodied in the issues inherent in the Aramark-Sodexo contract, and in issues that we've dealt with, and issues and decisions just like it that we've had to deal with for the last 5 years. I will talk about those issues at the end of my statement. As President-elect of the Chicago Principals and Administrators Association, I want to voice my concern on behalf of principals in regard to the board's decision to expand the Aramark and Sodexo pilot programs. And in order to do that, I want to look at this decision in the light of the SOUP's no-bid contract scandal, for which Barbara Byrd Bennett was indicted and convicted, because we have to learn the lessons of history. When Barbara Byrd Bennett arrived, one of the first things that she began to do was lay the groundwork for the $20 million no-bid contract. And she laid that groundwork with a pilot program for just a couple of $1 million. Despite the fact that principals complained bitterly about the quality of that pilot program, which was conducted by SOUPS, Mayor Emanuel's hand-picked Board of Education rewarded SOUP's incompetence by expanding that program and giving them a $20 million no-bid contract to continue the training that principals by and large said was a waste of their time. Principals continued to complain, but their complaints fell on deaf ears. Now today, we all know that CPS didn't listen to our complaints about quality because quality programming was not the real agenda. The real agenda was to line the pockets of Barbara Byrd Bennett and the owners of the SOUPS Corporation, owners who are also connected with the Emanuel administration. Now, just like we should have asked questions about SOUPS then, we need to ask those same questions about Aramark and Sodexo today. These companies were brought in by Tim Cawley, who himself was brought into CPS by the Emanuel administration and given a waiver of the residency requirement in order to bring him in. Before Cawley, custodians reported to the principal, before Cawley, custodians reported to the engineer, and the engineer reported to the principal. It was an elegant and simple line of command. Cawley decided to have custodians report directly to principals, with the engineer still in the building. That was his first move, and this created a massive problem for principals. Then, as a solution to the problem he had just created, Cawley came in and said, okay, principals, we're going to relieve your issues by bringing in Aramark and Sodexo and paying them $340 million to manage the custodians for you. And we were bewildered by this because the engineers were still right there in the building with us. And they could have managed those custodians at no extra cost. But they paid Aramark and Sodexo $340 million to do what the engineers could have done at no extra cost. The board plowed forward once again and signed those contracts. Shortly afterward, Aramark and Sodexo shortly after they took over custodial management, the filth in our schools became national headlines. In 2014, there was a survey conducted of principals in which nearly 80% said Sodexo and Aramark were worse or significantly worse than the management of custodians under our engineers. And the same amount of principals said they spent significantly more time managing custodians. So principals were, in fact, doing the job that CPS was paying Aramark and Sodexo $340 million to do. A subsequent 2015 survey revealed that things had only gotten worse, with more than 90% of principals reporting that their schools were cleaner before Aramark and Sodexo. Here are a few quotes from the survey. Aramark cut my custodial staff. They waxed over dirt, pencil shavings, and scuff marks. Sinks, desks, and tables were left dirty. We have always taken pride in the way our building was maintained. Now it is substandard at best. Aramark left this building dirtier than when they came in. These are actual quotes from principals. Children's blocks and document cameras were stolen or lost. Communication is dismal. Nightmare is the best word to describe working with this system. Now you would think that after hearing that kind of feedback and hearing those complaints, that CPS would return our custodians to the management of our building engineers, since they were right there. Instead, CPS is now attempting to pay vast sums of money to Aramark and Sodexo to privatize the engineers themselves. Add to this the complaints that Sodexo was forced to pay $80 million to settle a class action discrimination lawsuit by thousands of their employees. Why is our district doing business with these people? What will it take to bring an end to the waste of hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars? In both Soups and Aramark Sodexo, CPS gave contracts to companies connected with the mayor's office. In both cases, CPS spent millions of dollars on those contracts at the time they were claiming poverty and cutting funding from schools and classrooms. In both cases, principals exposed the substandard performance of both companies. In both cases, CPS refused to listen to principals, refused to listen to our voices, and continued to expand their spending on these contracts. In the case of Soups, the owners of the company agreed to give the mayor's appointed CEO $2.3 million in exchange for her steering $23 million of contracts their way. In the case of Sodexo issued a check for $250,000 to the Rahm Emanuel campaign right after the mayor's hand-picked Board of Education voted to steer an $80 million contract towards Sodexo. We must understand that corruption breeds incompetence. If the service that Soup provided was valuable, they would not need to bribe officials into these contracts. Districts would be lining up to get their services. But because their services were lacking in quality, they had to bribe a public official into wasting your tax dollars on their substandard services. So when you see a school district today continuing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on Aramark and Sodexo for services that principals have consistently described as substandard, we must consult the lessons of history. And those lessons tell us that the air is saturated with the smell of corruption and pay to play. In the case of Soup, CPS refused to act. It took an FBI investigation and an indictment and conviction to bring that horrendous public waste of money to an end. That did not come with CPS ending it. The FBI ended it. In the case of Aramark and Sodexo, CPS once again is refusing to act. What will it take to end this reckless spending and this incompetent management of our school facilities? We must ask and answer this question because corruption does more than breed incompetence. Corruption robs our schools of the resources that they need to ensure our children reach their potential. At a time when CPS is asking the state to bail it out, CPS officials need to demonstrate to downstate lawmakers that they can be responsible with the funds they have. What lawmaker is going to vote to give additional funds to a district that won't stop wasting the funds it has? So I ask educators, residents, lawmakers, parents, and students to put pressure on our officials to stop this wasteful spending on privatization and return our engineers to to the supervision, return our custodians to the supervision of our engineers, and return our engineers to the supervision of our principals. I will close by saying and reminding you all once again that a record number of principals have resigned from CPS this year, and the year isn't even up yet. And they have resigned in part for 3 reasons that are embodied by this contract and every contract and decision before it. Those 3 reasons are a lack of decision-making power and autonomy, the fact that their voices are not heard in CPS policy decisions that affect their schools, and the fact that the resources that they need to impact their children are being squandered away, to the point where today principals are being asked once again to figure out what resources they're going to take away from their children now. I had principals tell me that the district is telling them they can no longer have assistant principals in some network. You cannot do this work without someone beside you helping to bear that load. And CPS is telling principals that they have to bear that load alone and cut student resources in the process. At a city level and a school district level, we need champions for our students in our schools. And we don't have champions right now. What we have are people who make excuses and pass the buck, that it is Springfield's fault. Inaction in Springfield is no excuse for inaction in Chicago. They could have raised revenue 5 years ago, but they keep passing the buck to Springfield. And when we don't have leadership internally that'll do what's necessary, we need someone externally to look into CPS. And so I support the Engineers Union calling for an external investigation of this contract. Thank you.
Thank you, Troy.